This is episode 2 of the Median Athlete Show. Michelle and I just had a quick discussion about, you had a similar idea and a name for us normies. That's another great word is, the median is, people that are kind of not pros. We're in the middle of the road, maybe the back of the pack, so to speak. With me today is a former colleague and friend of mine, Michelle Taylor. Michelle, would you mind giving a quick introduction about yourself and then go through athletic background, and we'll go from there?
Yeah. So I work full time. I am a doctor in my day-to-day life. And at some point, I recall watching an old documentary called Running on the Sun. It was about Badwater 135. I think it came out maybe in the 90s. I remember watching that and saying to my mom and dad, I want to do that one day. I was not athletic in high school. I swam a little bit and had a knee injury. So I essentially stopped any traditional sports at that point. I didn't do any training until later in life. I started running again in med school as a way to cope with stress. I told my parents, maybe I should run that race. My parents said, maybe you should try a race or train. That's when I started to think more about what it would look like to get to the point where I might even be able to apply for Badwater. At that point in my life, I also had to figure out how I was going to work training in with residency, fellowship, and then being a doctor. I've been on that journey for some time now. I did my first sanctioned race 7 years ago, and it was a marathon. I slowly built my base to the point where now I do hundreds. I've attempted Cocodona. That was a DNF for me, which I'm fine with. I'll go back there one day and finish it, hopefully. Now I do hundreds regularly and keep a base such that I don't really have to alter my training when I go into a 100-miler or other ultra marathon.
As far as when you say 100 or 135, those are always in miles?
Those are all miles. I guess that's not a path I would necessarily recommend. In recent years, a couple popular social media, people have popularized this idea of staying hard. I don't necessarily know that the average person should not ever run a distance between a marathon and then set out to do a 100-miler, but that is what I did. I've stayed consistently at the 100-mile distance unless there's something that really interests me or I'm just doing it for fun. I did Badwater Cape Fear, I did the 50-miler of that just as kind of idea of what a Badwater race is like. But typically I run 100-milers now.
Okay. And what did training, so go back to your first ultra 100-miler. How did that look like going from a marathon all the way to 100?
I had read somewhere online that you can't build to 100 in the way we traditionally think about marathons. Most marathon training programs will say, if you do a 20-mile race, you're pretty much ready, which is a good chunk of the distance you'll do in the marathon. It doesn't make sense to do that in ultra marathon training. You're not going to do a 90-mile training run to make sure you can get to 100. I read online that the best bet was to run 2 days back to back, the first day being a 30-mile run and the second day being 20 to 25-mile run, and have that be your goal or peak in preparation. So what I did to get from the marathon distance to my first 100-miler was slowly build my base over potentially like a year time, where a 50 to 60-mile week didn't feel like a big impact on me personally. Like, I didn't feel too fatigued. I felt like I was still getting sleep. I felt like I could maintain my nutrition. Then I started working with a 3-week build, 1 week off phased program to the point where I slowly built up my weekend miles and got a 30 followed by a 20-miler. And then I tapered back down. 1 week might have been a 70-mile, then the next week a 75-mile, then an 85-mile, slowly increasing the length of those long runs to the point where I could do 30 and 20 back to back, with the goal being, what does it feel like to operate on tired legs? In all of my subsequent 100 milers. I still stick to that. I think my current base is such that I've been running so long that I don't feel like I have to always hit a 30 and 20 back to back. I think if I do 2 marathons back to back, or maybe even 3 20 milers across 3 days of the week, that preparation is enough for me. But I still stick to that build 3 weeks, 1 week of low mileage.
That's good to know. That 1 week of low mileage just helps you recover.
Absolutely. I really try and increase my sleep during that time and make sure I'm on point with my nutrition, and that I'm doing everything I can to recover to the extent that I feel like I'm ready to go back in and increase my mileage.
And that mileage, is that primarily road for you? Do you get to be on the trails much? That's difference in impact, you
Yeah.
know?
I think everyone has to approach training for races in a way that works for them. I live in Florida, it's flat, and I can run either sand or roads. So for me, it works out to be primarily road miles, regardless of the type of race. If it's appropriate, I incorporate other types of training so I'm getting what I need for that race. For example, when I was training for Cocodona, I went to a gym so that I would have access to a stair climber and have access to a sauna for heat training. So I would maybe do my normal running miles, go to a gym in the afternoon, do 30 minutes on the stair climber, and jump immediately into a sauna. I did that for about 8 weeks building up to Cocodona. I did the stair climber for even longer, but the sauna component, I did about 8 weeks up to Cocodona to try and be a little more specific. I'll do that when I can. I'll run trails when I can, but again, it's Florida and trails are sand, which isn't similar to most anything else I'd run.
Okay. Talk about your first race. What was that like?
Yeah, so my first 100 miler was the Keys 100. It's a point to point race from Key Largo to Key West. It is generally considered a flat course, with the exception of one very high bridge that we have in Florida. And people would say it's could be run quickly depending on the weather. I think the record is like a 16-hour finish, but it was my first race and I just wanted to finish. It was a wet year for the Keys 100. It's not the wettest in recent history, but it did rain on me for about 6 hours through the middle of the night. I started out the race and it was immediately apparent, just battling how wet everything was going to be a long-term task for that race. For Keys, a lot of people run with ice in their hat or an ice bandana around their neck, and that's dripping the entire time into your shorts, into your socks, into your shoe. I had planned on for that race changing socks at the same time. So I was anticipating anywhere from 4 to 8 sock and shoe changes, trying to use fresh pairs of shoes, which meant I had to drive a lot of shoes down there. But it worked out. The whole time was really blister management, managing just being soaking wet. And then, of course, the rain added to that. One of the things hard about some of the flat road hundreds here in Florida is they also run a lot of them as relays. I kept seeing people flying past me because they were relay teams and they started like in later waves. And it would get to me like, why are they going? I have been running for 45 miles. Why are they running so fast? The mental struggle of the ultra marathon started earlier because I couldn't figure out why they were so quick. Ultimately, I saw one of their vans. The Keys is kind of like a party race. People deck out these vans. There's big pool inflatables on top of them. People are screaming. Right. They've got like clappers. And I was like, oh, that's why they're so fast. That helped me understand I shouldn't set any expectations for being around anybody else. And then the one other main issue I faced outside of just being wet the entire time was understanding the impact of heat on my desire to eat food. I think I went in knowing that eating was going to be a struggle. I trained with a lot of food to gauge what would work, but It was challenging to eat through the hottest part of the day. And in the later miles, my crew had to get whatever I asked for. And that's particularly challenging in the Keys where gas stations are potentially not as like flush with supplies as they might be in more populated areas. I should also note that the Keys is not a race where there are aid stations. A crew is required, and you are only supported from the vehicle. They have designated spots, and if you don't adhere to where you can get aid, you could have time added to your total finish time. I really started feeling it. I felt like, why am I doing this at mile 70? I think traditionally people that do ultra marathons talk about the pain cave. And I really started to feel the pain cave at mile 70. Around mile 70 is a 7-mile bridge, one of the highest bridges because cruise ships can go directly under it. So it's quite
it's a climb.
Bit of elevation gain for what you'd think would be a flat ultra. I hit it at night, and to me, it was like, oh man, this is going to be a lot and long. I knew I couldn't get aid during it. It was raining at that point. A lot. But I had it in my head. And I think that's one of the battles of running ultras, long distance races. I decided I'm going to finish this once I hit that bridge. There's no question about that. If I can get to that bridge, I am going over the bridge and getting these last. I hallucinated on that race. I don't always hallucinate in 100 milers, but I did on that race. For people watching your podcast that aren't familiar with ultra runs, it's relatively common in 100 milers. It's a combination of lack of nutrition, fatigue, lack of sleep, and how long you've been moving. I call my witching hours like 2 to 4 a.m. So 2 to 4 a.m. I started hallucinating. I finished. It took about 3 days to fully recover. And then I immediately signed up for another one. It was really something.
So it's incredible. Back to nutrition during the race. Are you calculating basically how much, probably 600, 800 calories an hour, maybe 1,000 calories an hour?
I mean,
get back in?
I try and eat as much as I can while I'm willing to eat and then switch to liquid. This is something I definitely think about now. I have a much easier time drinking high calorie drinks during a race than I do sticking solely to traditional nutrition. And also I'll mention that in the world of ultra marathons, you don't rely on just gel. Some people might, but gel after a long period of time, like if you read the back of the package of goo, it says to take one every 45 minutes. You would have diarrhea the entire race if you did that for 20 hours of an ultra marathon, and it would be miserable. So you have to start consuming real food. I think there's another really good podcaster that talks about like the circle of the way you should think about your nutrition. Something should be carb heavy, more salty, and something you're willing to eat, like sweets or whatever sounds good. So I know I'll easily drink full calorie iced tea with extra maple syrup added to it, usually without complaint. Like if it's cold, if it's been on ice, I'll drink it. And so I usually have my crew grab me a ton of iced tea at the beginning of it. I live in the South. It's not like Alabama, but the sweet tea is available in places here in Florida. I usually start with a bunch of sweet tea in the vehicle, and then I'll incorporate things like Scratch or Tailwind, depending on how much salt I feel I need and how my stomach's feeling. I can gauge it, and I think a lot of runners probably can, by how much swelling they're seeing in their hands and feet. I can tell if I'm really retaining water. Maybe I need to alter the way I'm consuming my salt. I usually stick to liquid nutrition when I'm unwilling to eat. While I'm willing to eat, for me, I just trained with a variety of foods. I trained with pretzels. I trained with bean burritos. I trained with watermelon. I've trained with normal, like what we would think of as traditional race food, like Cliff Blocks. I don't use the gel at all, but I'll use like other types of things, honey stinger waffles. I drink a lot of coconut water, which I wouldn't drink on a normal daily basis, but I think it's got a good mix of electrolytes for racing. And I'll just try my best to like consume to the point that I can. And I usually give my crew a hint to tell me if I haven't eaten at least 400 calories in the last hour. If I don't eat, they're going to go tell the race director I'm quitting. So usually that's enough for me personally to say I'm going to eat if I really don't want to. And they're like, oh, we're tracking and you've not eaten anything. You need to eat 400 calories by the next time we see you. I will eat whatever they give me within reason. But all of the nutrition has come with training. And for most ultra marathons, when there are traditional aid stations, they have a variety of real food. They don't as frequently have like chews or blocks available, but they'll usually have some kind of pretzel or chip. They'll usually have Coke. That's an ultra runner's secret. I think that's probably a secret for a lot of sports people. So they'll have Coke or ginger ale, and oftentimes they'll have broth or chicken noodle soup or mashed potatoes or pancakes if you've switched over to morning time. I trained with a lot of stuff that might be on courses for other races that I was going to have to travel to try and adjust to what they might have available. Sometimes stuff sounds good that I've never eaten before. During Cocodona, I asked my crew to get me popsicles, and I've never looked back from eating popsicles during a race after that one time.
Nice.
I really think understanding nutrition for most people doing ultra endurance events comes down to trying things, but at least being comfortable with something that's high carb, being comfortable with some type of mixed drink or drink that has higher calories that can help, and some kind of saltier food substance or a drink that has higher salt content, like a Scratch or Tailwind or whatever. And then also being comfortable with a couple of foods that'll just make you feel good, like gummy bears. Like I'll eat a gummy bear anytime, whatever. Give me gummy bears, give me M&Ms, whatever. I'll typically eat those things.
Sour Patch Kids.
Like if I'm not eating anything, I'll grab that from an aid station or tell my crew to get it.
Awesome. So you've done a handful of races over the years. Mm-hmm. So what was your favorite race, if you have one?
I would say the Keys is probably one of my favorite races. The race I always go back to here in Florida is the Daytona 100. It's now owned by the same gentleman that owns the Keys, a guy famous in the ultra running world, Bob Decker. He's one of the oldest finishers ever of the Badwater 135. And he now owns Daytona. It is absolutely a flat, fast course. I think records there are closer to the 12-hour record for the 100-mile finish. It's a race I love going back to.
How many times have you run that one?
I think like 4 times now, and I'm registered again for it this year, and I'll probably register it again for next year.
Is that your next race?
The race I was most recently supposed to run, I actually didn't go. Depending on when you air this podcast, people have heard of Hurricane Helene. It came over Florida and then impacted much of the Southeast. I would have been driving from my home to Miami for the Miami 100 last weekend, and I didn't feel comfortable making that drive. I decided to call it and move my registration to next year. Oftentimes, race directors for ultra events can't return your race fee or give a refund because they've already purchased medals and stuff. But the race director for the Miami 100 allowed people that were Florida or impacted states to defer entry to next year. I will say for people interested in running a first ultra, some of the Florida ones probably aren't ideal. Most require you to have your own crew unless it's a looped course. There are really good from a company called Aravaipa. They put on the Black Canyon Ultras. They put on Javelina 100, which is a pretty well-known 100-miler. And they do Cocodona 250. And they do an excellent job for anybody that wants a great experience for a first 100-miler or 200-miler or whatever distance they're into. I think Aravaipa really puts on a great race, and it's usually very well supported. Their aid stations are stocked. Their volunteers are excellent. They're putting on a great race for people into this kind of thing.
I have maybe an ultra marathon on my list at some point.
Sure.
I haven't quite figured that one out yet. Okay. But definitely would start small. Jumping straight to 100 sounds doable, but also crazy.
Yeah. I recommend for people interested in hundreds to find somebody to crew so you can see what that person is going through, or volunteer. Yeah. Most races are always looking for volunteers to help where aid stations are. Usually you can volunteer for being at an aid station. I will just throw out a note. I am a doctor. A lot of these races do have medical at some level, and most of it's just basic first aid. If you're in the medical profession, a nurse, an EMT, nurse practitioner, a doctor, you could always volunteer as a medic to a race first and see what that's like. And in some instances, they'll give you a discount on a future race.
Okay. And for new runners, what would be something to look out for during their race, like health-wise, like rhabdo or something to keep on?
I think the few things that I really try to be mindful of is I've always told my crew to keep track of the swelling in my hands, especially because you are talking primarily about the experience of normies running this. If you walk in races, which I do, and there's nothing wrong with, I mean, ultra marathoners call it hiking because we don't want to say we're walking, but I walk during races. And when you walk, your hands are down at the side of your body more than when you're running, right? Your hands are up here. And so they tend to become dependent, and they'll be one of the first places to swell. So I've always told my crew to be mindful of how much water they can see on my face, in my hands, anywhere that looks like it's a dependent part of my body, in my legs, because that means something's probably off with either how much water I'm drinking compared to how much salt I'm eating, how much I'm sweating. And I usually tell them, like, the first sign is if I ask to take off a ring, which I always run with this ring on, and I switch my wedding rings to a silicone band. I usually say, if I ask to take the silicone band off, we need to start thinking about that. But I also suggest to people that are interested in this to really be mindful of your feet care. If you don't take care of something that's hurting in your sock immediately, it will only become worse. And then your whole foot will be a blister. If you feel like you need to look at your feet, check out your socks, or you feel like you're starting to get chafed, address that immediately. Because once it's to the point that it's painful, something bigger has started that you won't be able to address.
Don't let it get out of hand.
I think people that do this kind of thing don't want to DNF, right? There's this idea of DFL before DNF, which is dead last instead of did not finish. As a doctor, to the vast majority of the population that also have to go to work the next day, this isn't my full-time job. I still have to live my life. Anything happening during the race that feels like it would impact my long-term ability to function in life is a reason I would call it. I had a race that I was running, TNOA 100 miler. It's a pretty tough race. And I stepped in a hornet's nest. I got stung about 7 times around my ankle. I didn't have anything on me to get what I thought was remaining stingers out, and I needed to work 2 days after. So it was like, I need to get off the course. I also DNF'd a race because I hadn't urinated for about 10 hours. And I was pretty concerned at that point. I don't need to go to the ER because I'm not peeing. Anything that feels like a logical person would say, okay, I need to reconsider this, especially if racing isn't your full-time job. It's worth reevaluating, finishing the race, and addressing it next time. That's what these adventures are about to me. It's problem solving and figuring out how we can get ahead of problems or fix a problem next time if it continues to occur.
That's one of the things about a lot of first timers. So whether it's a marathon or if it's a tri or if it's an ultra, you signed up, you put a lot of pressure on yourself to finish this race. Marathon runners, 1% of the population's done a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're doing an ultra and you've gone past a marathon, you've done more than most of the population already, it's okay to DNF. Take care of yourself, put yourself first.
Absolutely.
Take the pressure off of finishing. For me, goal A was like this certain time, and goal B was finish. For ultra, goal A is just finish, and goal B is don't take care of yourself. Don't die.
Absolutely.
So
one of the things about ultras that's unique was you really start to notice that you're leapfrogging the same people. So I think then you're like, you may have a conversation with them and run with them. There's people that I who I saw struggling, and I was like, let's get to the end of this race together. Let's work together. Let me help you for X amount of time. Let me get you to the next aid station. A lot of ultras is also about having fun and being a part of a community. There are some ultras, particularly in Canada and maybe in Europe, where if there is someone in distress and you don't help them, you will automatically be disqualified. I think a lot of ultra marathoners pride themselves on saying, if somebody's having a hard time, even if it's damaging to my race, I will help them.
That's awesome. That's signs of a very positive community. It sounds like you probably made a lot of friends doing this as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially with adults, loneliness is a big thing, especially in our society. So finding that community, I've found it a lot in triathlon right now. I'm sure you're seeing the same thing with your ultra marathon community too, right?
Yeah, for Cocodona, especially, which was a 250 miler, I spent 4 full days with the same guy. And we just agreed, like, let's work together. Let's, do as much as we can together. If anything happens and we're not going to finish, let's try and make sure the other person has everything they need to get through the rest of the race. I still continue to talk with him. I still talk to the two girls that also DNF'd at that aid station. I ran Rocky Raccoon and finished, but I spent the last 20 miles with a guy who was his first 100 and he was going to quit. And I said, just stay with me and I'll get you the last 20 miles, even if we're walking. We got there and I still talk to him. I've really met a lot of positive people trying to do something interesting or hard with their lives and overcome a challenge. They're all really great folks. A great sense of community, and you can make a lot of friends. Even the people I don't continue to talk to, I've met some really cool people. I met the project manager for Boeing's space launch. I've met really interesting people, a cardiothoracic surgeon, a retired plastic surgeon, just some really cool people that had a lot of really interesting life stories. And we just shared some miles. And it was good at the moment because it uplifted me and encouraged me to keep going.
And speaking of positive people, what about your most hated race for whichever reason you wanted, whatever reason that is?
Yeah, I run hot races. I'd run it again, but I would say Rocky Raccoon, the year I ran it, which is in Texas, it was definitely below freezing. It might have been 25 degrees Fahrenheit. It was unpleasant. I had not properly anticipated how cold that was going to feel. It's a looped course, 4 times around a 25-mile loop, if I remember correctly. I was uncrewed using my own car mixed with their aid stations. I had set up my own aid station in the trunk. At one point in the middle of the night, I got back in the vehicle. I turned it on and I was like, oh, I'm just going to get a little warm. And that's when I was like, oh God, it is really miserable out here. Why is it so cold? I'm just not meant for cold. And I don't know that I'd ever go back. It was just too cold. It was very cold. So yeah, that would be probably my least favorite race I've ever done. But I would say a lot of people really love that race. It's also a well-organized race. It just wasn't great for me because it was so cold. But okay. A very interesting race for people that would like to do it. It's called Rocky Raccoon, but it's not rocky. It's got a lot of tree roots that are going to trip you.
Trip over them.
It should be.
Did you fall?
Oh, yeah. I fell at least 7 times. I counted. So 7 is the correct number. It was crazy.
And then bucket list race. Do you have it?
Yeah. Bucket list races. Probably at this point, still trying to work on an application for Badwater and at least applying. I'd love to do it. It's definitely got different challenges than the races here in Florida. Races here in Florida are very, very humid, regardless of what time of the year you run them. And you're typically drenched in sweat. It's very hot. I'd also love to get Cocodona 250 done. So probably going back to Cocodona 250 or getting Badwater done. If Badwater, for those of your listeners that don't know this, Badwater requires a written submission and a letter of why you should do it. You have to have run at least 300 milers in the past 3 years. I don't know exactly. You get there's some benefit of running the other Badwater races like Salton Sea or Cape Fear. But it's a much more robust application process. And there's a cap on runners every year. And it's something like 100, 125, something like that. I don't know that I'd ever get in, but to be that.
No Barkley?
No, come on.
Why not?
I'm not crazy. Barkley's an interesting race. I would run some of Laz's other races. He has a race across one of the US states. I can't remember which state right
Is it
now.
Tennessee?
Yeah, it might be Tennessee.
I think
And
so.
I would do that race over Barkley. I know that I probably couldn't even get a singular loop done in Barkley just because I don't know that I have any sense of direction. So that would probably be a real fail on my part.
It is a different layer. It's so much fun to watch and follow along, but yeah, it's a whole different layer of crazy.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned cold training, it's always, was it March or April?
Yes.
It's usually very cold,
Yep.
very hilly, obviously. So yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different formats. Like, I think just much like the world of triathlons, right? You have like different distances that y'all
Yep.
can do, and there's different kind of formats for ultra marathons. There's like there are last man standing type races where you just do a certain amount of miles on the hour every hour until only one person's left. There's single stage races where it's just you're running this amount of miles in, you have to finish it in the time frame cap. Or there's the multi-day stage races where maybe you're running, a longer or varied distance across many days. So there's a lot of different formats. And then there's just even different formats within the race itself, like a looped course or an out and back or a point to point. And people like different things. And I just don't know that like Barkley as a looped course without a GPS and no known trail really feels like I don't know that I could get that done. So yeah.
Know thyself. It's good to know. So I guess point to point is probably your favorite then?
I'll take a loop course. I've never had a pacer in a race, and I don't think pacers are used in triathlons, but in ultra marathons, especially over 50 miles, you may, in some instances, be allowed a pacer. Most instances, they can't carry your stuff, but they can just keep you awake through the night, like yell at
Okay.
you, tell you to go faster. I've never used a pacer, but I do always, or not always, but I typically have crew. But if for whatever reason I just want to go to a race and like I know somebody doesn't really want to travel to the race to crew me, that's when I like a looped course because I can keep my stuff in a vehicle or potentially have the option of like putting it in the same bag and I'm going to know where it is. That's not that I don't like normal drop bags. My preference is not that way.
So if you would have a pacer, do you need multiple pacers to actually make it worthwhile? Not everyone can do an ultra with you. Is there someone like a friend of yours who can run with you for a certain segment of time?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the race you're doing and the way the course is. For some of the more publicized races like Western States or Hard Rock or even now Cocodona, that you can watch a live stream of it. A lot of times you'll have a pacer for those kind of races that can do a big chunk with you and is capable of going at least 25 miles with you. For the races I do, it doesn't have to be that way. If you have a pacer at these predominantly flat road ultras, if I have two people in the car willing to do 5 miles, but then maybe want a 5 mile break, it's a lot easier to swap with another person. It means that I don't necessarily have to have people comfortable doing a half marathon or a marathon in one shot. As long as they're willing to pick up 13 miles with me, then hop back in the car and swap with someone else, that works too. And we see a lot of that in these kind of races that I do in the road races. It's much more swapping of pacers.
I think that's on my list to at some point be able to join you in pace, but
Yeah, absolutely.
to build a little bit.
I will say for anybody looking to do this and feels like they have to run the full 100 miles, like I definitely walk or hike. And I actually train to walk, hike faster. I incorporate a lot of weighted walking or rucking and walking training into my regular race training. I try to guarantee that I feel comfortable walking at least once in my each training cycle. I'll try and do at least a 20-mile walk at a pace that's a 15-minute mile or below. So when I'm doing an ultra and I switch to walking, I will start at like trying to hold a 14-minute mile walking pace. And later in the race, if I can keep my walking pace under a 15-minute mile, I usually feel good about that. But once you get blisters later in the race, all bets are off, right? I've seen people walking a 22, 25-minute mile at the end of these races. It's truly a death march. Their feet are just coated in blisters. They're sunburned in these races. They're like hunched over because you get this like lean in some ultra marathons. And there's no scientific literature that I can find that says why that happens, but it's likely an electrolyte imbalance. People will be barely moving forward. For people new to this sport, training to be able to walk quickly and feel strong doing it is an important component of ultra training.
Yeah, the bare minimum is just being able to keep moving.
Yes.
For 16 hours, however long it.
I actually interacted with a guy who did Daytona as just strictly the Daytona 100 as a strictly walking challenge. The cap on time for the Daytona 100 is 32 hours, I believe. And he felt like, okay, that meant he did the math. Don't quote me on this, but I guess that's probably less than an 18-minute mile or 20-minute mile the entire time. His goal was just to go in and walk the whole thing. And I saw him finish. He was maybe in his late 60s, early 70s. And he's like, yeah, I just like to stay healthy. And I just wanted to walk one of these things. And I thought I could do it. He just like,
and he did it.
So, I think a lot of the races I do, so long as you have an average pace of somewhere less than a 20-minute mile for these, especially these flat kind of Florida hundreds, you can get it done, which is not fast, right? That is a most person's walk, or maybe even slower than most person's walk.
That's a great way to actually just get into it. You can just walk it if you wanted to.
Right.
That's interesting.
And I think I actually at one point had looked at my keys average, average minute mile at some point from my first race. And now bear in mind, a lot of this is because I sat I told my half marathon, I'm going to sit down for 10 minutes, and every full marathon, I'm going to sit down for 20 minutes. But I think when it all calculated out, it was just under average of 17-minute mile over the duration of the race. And that figures in like the entire time sitting, using the bathroom, stopping and eating, I don't know, barfing on the side of the road, whatever. That's all of it, right? So it's totally doable for somebody that just trains to walk it too.
And how important is heart rate in all of this? Do you monitor your heart rate? Do you make sure it doesn't get too high? That's probably you're not on lactate.
I think one of the things that differentiates triathletes probably from the ultra marathon crew is like, I don't think about my watts or the power I'm putting out,
right,
or really my heart rate all that much. I just want it to be under a certain point for the most part. If it gets high, if I'm running like higher than, for me, it's like, if I'm over 148 for an extended period of time, especially during the heat of the day, then something's going downhill. And I need to be more mindful of cooling or what I'm doing to monitor that, maybe slow down. I don't think ultra marathoners think about like those topics the way, and we don't have as much cool tech, so for that in mind. Like I got nothing to really, I don't think anything, maybe it's out there, but I don't think the foot pods you can wear on your feet are doing or able to measure as much as what you do with a bike, right? It's just hard to get that kind of data. My heart rate is kind of high. I'll back off. But I don't wear a heart rate monitor. I'm just measuring it off the watch that I wear.
So is that zone 2 for you?
Yeah, that's zone 2.
Got it. So another draw is you don't need a lot of gear. Is there any gear that you want to highlight or say like this really helped me either during races, during training, or during like any strength training or rehab or anything like that? Anything you just Love.
Yeah, I would say the super important gear for ultra marathoners is some way to carry water. If you're on trail, there's probably going to be an extended period of time where you're not going to have access to water, whether that's via a handheld, via, some kind of waist belt, or via a full vest. And I have all of those options that like I run with and use for different types of races. For me, a way to carry water is the most important. I tried out a lot of different styles and fits of vests, which is a little bit harder to do nowadays because most running or sport stores really only have what an average marathoner would use. So it's hard to try something. So I would say if you have access to people that have different types of vests, potentially ask them. But I started with a 5 liter carrying capacity and quickly moved to a 12 liter. I use a Solomon vest and I've never looked back. When it's hot, I keep a waist belt so I can switch to it if I'm chafing anywhere that my vest hits later in a race. And I do keep a handheld in case that starts really chafing. But, having some way to get appropriate hydration is probably the most important factor for me.
Nice.
That's the key thing. Recovery wise, like a foam roller, and then whatever. Everybody's like, oh, you need recovery boots, but I don't have room in my house for recovery boots. Some kind of like percussor instrument, whether you want to buy a cheap one on Amazon or an expensive one that's much nicer, like some kind of massager that can help you after, I think is really good. And
Yep.
Epsom salts. Recovery wise, those are probably the things that I rely on the most.
Do you do ice baths?
I don't, but it's something I'm looking into to see if there'd be a way to do it at my house. I know that a lot of social media athletes do it.
I've seen those videos before. Just like the daily plunge.
The other thing I would say is something that most ultra athletes should really consider if you are carrying a vest. I always, no matter the distance, carry a personal first aid kit that I've curated for myself. I was doing training runs for Coconut out in Arizona, and I took a really bad fall and cut open the back of my arm. I didn't have any way to clean it, and I flushed it out with, I think I was using Tailwind. And so I just like squeezed Tailwind. Probably that. I carry alcohol pads. After I got stung by insects, I started carrying Afterbite. I carry a tiny nail clipper in case I need to pop something or tweeze something out. I can try and like use the nail clipper that way.
Yep.
I keep a gauze pad in there. I keep appropriate blister care in there. I keep a couple extra Band-Aids. I keep a, what do we call those? Like the thermal, they're not thermal blankets, but I cannot think of the word for them right now. The weird silver.
Like the foil ones?
Yeah, foil. I keep a pair of hand warmers in a small Ziploc bag in one of the pockets of my vest. So I always have it. I think the other like things I have in there are whistle, a pair of, or something that's like sunscreen. I have like an individual pouch of sunscreen and the lip balm sunscreen. So, you can tailor that, but I think having some level of like first aid that you could access if you are not going to be with crew for a long period of time is pretty valuable.
That's handy to know. So we've talked about the races a lot. We talked about nutrition during the race.
Mm-hmm.
What does nutrition look like while you're living, while you're training?
Yeah.
How do you function?
Sure. Since I work a normal job, I prefer to run early in the day. I have adjusted my daily schedule so that I wake up more at like 3 or 4 a.m., get my run in. And in order to just compensate for the daily miles to keep that 60-mile base, I probably eat a considerable amount of carbs. I make sure to eat some level of carb before most runs. If I'm doing anything over a 5-mile run, it's not fasted. And I typically don't run anything fasted. I would eat some level of nutrition beforehand. And I usually stick to stuff that's carb heavy. I am plant-based. So throughout the day, I just try and make sure I'm eating healthy carbohydrates, but balancing that with the amount of fiber that's in plant-based carbs. So I can only eat so many potatoes before I may be consuming too much fiber. So I just try and be cognizant of getting in, healthy plant-based nutrients and fiber, not too much fiber, and then eating a lot of carbs. If it's a bad day and I run 20 miles, I will do the wrong thing and eat a package of Swedish fish just to get the carbs in there, that the calories to recover. But I do in general just, probably eat a lot more food than the average non-fitness person. I think people that are into like fitness, working out, any kind of athletics probably eat more than, unless you're like working out for a bodybuilding show, right? Like I definitely am over 2,000 calories a day, if not considerably over that. It's very carb heavy. Since I'm plant based, try and choose things rather than like beyond meat. I try and use clean plant based proteins like beans, tempeh, tofu, things like that.
Yeah, I've been working more chickpeas and beans
Yeah, absolutely.
and I love them. So what's your go-to morning breakfast? Do you have one?
Yeah, I really like go-go squeeze applesauce for a run, plus
Nice.
a kid-size granola bar. The ones that I personally like are Go Macro bars, but they make Go Macro Kids. It's like half the size of a normal adult granola bar, and it feels light enough pre-run. But there's very similar products to Go-Go Squeeze. Mama Chia is another one that I really like. It's just like pouched chia and fruit, like a fruit smoothie, but it's a chia, chia soaked in some kind of fruit.
Yep.
And then there's a newer brand on the market that does just like pureed mango and pureed pineapple in a squeeze pouch. So I'll rotate those. I run in Florida and it's hot. And so I like to try and not die of heat stroke by eating warm things early in the day. One thing I will say is I think a traditional breakfast of runners is like, oh, have peanut butter before you go out. You have to learn what works for you. Peanut butter works for a lot of people, but for me, if I eat any kind of nut butter or something high in fat and go for a run, I tend to have really bad reflux. I don't like having acid reflux composed of peanut butter. For me personally, that doesn't work. And that's just my body and how training is worked out for me, which is why I'm usually sticking to something that's strictly carbohydrate based in the morning rather than introducing fats into it.
Okay. Do you coffee in the morning as well?
I drink coffee. I am, I think we all have our vices, and I am an energy drink gal through and through. And so
Yeah.
currently and I whatever, this show isn't about that, but it's a lot to do with med school and the work schedule of residency, fellowship, and then being a practicing physician. It's just like I need a lot of caffeine in one shot, but it's not the right answer. I'm currently trying to quit energy drinks, so coffee, I'm drinking coffee again. I drink that before a run. Going into an ultra marathon, like a couple days leading into the hundreds, I try and also be really cognizant of my food a couple days prior. I don't want to eat so much fiber. Like as somebody that's plant-based, I do have, and I'm a doctor, so I'm not embarrassed to say this, but I have very regular bowel movements and I don't need to poop like 4 times during a 100-mile race. So I'll really try and move to like eating more pasta or stuff not as fiber heavy a couple days prior to the race. So I'm, don't poop 4 times, which is.
Do you have a pre-race meal, like a traditional, anything like that?
Oh,
Like I always eat this right before my race.
if I am in a state where Buc-ee's exists and I can drive past a Buc-ee's prior to the race, I will eat Buc-ee beaver nuggets the day beforehand because it feels like a great non-high fiber snack. I'm not saying it's healthy. I'm just saying it's delicious. Beaver nuggets are the way to go.
It's always a spectacle to go to Buc-ee's. We love Buc-ee's.
Very much so.
So recently we were talking about your treadmill record thing. Is that still in the works? What's your plan there?
I do have a potential interest in trying to hit the women's indoor consecutive days running a half marathon on a treadmill. The women's record is a doable number. I just have to fit it into race schedules. I think there's a possibility to work it in after Daytona, which is my next race, and then prior to my first race of 2025, which would likely be the Keys. I'll see if I can work it in, if it fits with my training. If not, and I think it's going to wear me out too much, I'll probably use it as something to target for 2026. I'm still interested in potentially seeing if I can do it.
And how many consecutive days is that? Do you remember?
Oh my gosh, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think the women's is about 3 months-ish. So I think it's, consecutive days of running a half marathon on a treadmill. And I think that's doable. It's just a bit over 3 months for the women, I think.
How do you have to apply and have someone monitor and prove that you're doing it? How does that work?
Yeah, there's an application process, and then they measure your particular treadmill and the way your belt is, and make sure that your belt would cover the distance it's supposed to cover, like that it's calibrated correctly, so it's actually measuring the accurate distance. And then you have to apply to essentially say, yeah, once, I mean, that's all part of the process of the application. You're applying and saying that I'm going to work on this, and then you have to prove that you've hit that distance every day. I have different ways that they want you to do that. And I think in some instances, it's like some of the treadmill data compare and like watch data, it has to be something that's been on your person the whole time, or recording on the instrument machine treadmill whole time.
3 months of consecutive, I mean, a lot can go wrong, but that'd be really cool to have that record.
I think it would be interesting because of the amount of work that goes into trying to set up the process. It might be after like I accomplish some of my other race goals. I definitely have DNFs that I want to go back. And so it may end up having to go after those, just because that would just make sense based on length of time to go through the process to get there.
How do you balance all this?
I think that I'm lucky. I've intentionally made it so that I have some unique aspects to my life that make it easier to do this. So I am child free. Me and my husband don't have children and won't have children. And so I don't have the added stress of caring for a family or worrying about my family. And it's not to say that somebody that has a family couldn't get this done. Many people do. It's just how you work it into your schedule and where you want to make sacrifices to make it work. Maybe that's waking up earlier on the weekends so that you can get your long run in before you go to like a kid's softball game. For me, it means waking up a lot earlier than the average person. You know, typical days of the week, I'm waking up at 3 a.m. to get my morning workout in. But that means, you know, I'm trying to go to bed around 9 or 10 p.m. And I'm often sacrificing sleep at the expense of getting my training in, which is why recovery weeks are so important, because I may get only, you know, 5-6 hours of sleep on a typical night, but during a recovery week, I can get 8 or 9 hours, the suggested amount, and optimize my sleep during, you know, that time. But, you know, it's figuring out a way that you can make it work into your lifestyle. So yeah, for me, it just happens to be waking up very early in the day and getting a run in. And that also allows for incoming calls for patient stuff through the evening. Most people aren't going to call me at 4 a.m., but I certainly would expect somebody to need me at 7 or 8 p.m. on some days.
Okay. Yeah, when I was doing heavy marathon training, I was getting up at 4:15, 4:30 maybe, and it was nice to be up, but also very stressful to not wake anyone else up.
Yeah.
Any tips on not waking up your spouse or anyone else?
I think sleep hygiene is very important. We don't have a TV in our bedroom, but I use a light to wake up. It's a program light that gradually gets brighter over a period of time. The light is pretty close to my face. It's on the nightstand right next to me. It will wake me up, but not him. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just lucky. I also think that, and this doesn't relate to not waking up a partner, but in terms of good recovery sleep, I think trying to sleep as cold as you can. I think the best sleep happens. There is some data on this, but I don't have the research article in front of me. The right temperature to sleep at is somewhere around 58 degrees. So I do sleep with a cooled blanket that has water in it that cools down. So I crank that down to like 56 degrees at night to recover. In terms of waking up, light has really helped me so I don't wake up my partner. But I also just prep everything in not our primary bedroom, like, you know, and not even the bathroom attached to our primary. So the primary bath, right? I have everything else in another room so that I can get all that ready outside of any bathrooms that I think would potentially lead to enough noise that I would wake him. And you know, that's a luxury because we have another bathroom in our house. I think just having everything ready so you're not fumbling around in drawers is super helpful.
I use my watch as my alarm. It'll just vibrate. That's helpful. you said prepping the night before, like laying all your clothes downstairs for
Yep.
me.
Yep.
The problem arises, and this happens so many times, where I forget something
Mm,
in the bedroom.
mm,
So I've gotten ready downstairs, and then I got to go back upstairs,
mhm,
go find the thing, like my
mhm.
sunglasses or
Sure.
whatever it was. It's like,
Yeah.
so
We've sacrificed one of our kitchen drawers to be my run supply stuff.
nice.
So instead of the only thing I would have to get out of a traditional dresser or my closet is the clothes I'm going to run in. I have short hair, so I run in hats, but my hats, my sunglasses, my electronics are all in a kitchen drawer. And it's a drawer intended for deep pots because it's a little bit deeper than average. And I've not used it for that. And instead, I, have all of my gear so that it won't be such a, it won't be like, oh, I have to go back and get this out of there, or like wake up my partner finding this thing wherever it could be in the bathroom or bedroom.
It's a good tip.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think if people are afraid to run ultras because they see what times the lead athletes are putting down and it puts them off, the reality is that's an elite group of people that are sponsored. Ultra marathons don't have considerable purses, at least not in the United States. It's not like the prize fund is really great, but they're sponsored. They're on contracts with a shoe company, a clothing company, a nutrition company. That can be their whole life. But for people that are just normal, don't think you can't run an ultra marathon, whether that's a 50K, a 100K, a 50 miler, a 100 miler, just because you don't think you're going to finish quickly. You can absolutely walk, do 5 minutes off, 5 minutes on, whatever, and figure out a way to achieve your goals. The fun of ultras is in finishing, and you'll be so happy. You'll cry happy tears, and it'll be sad tears because you're in so much pain. And then 2 days later, you'll sign up again because it was such a good time. It's really just such an enjoyable experience. It is easily more fun in the mid to the back of the pack because you're hanging out with other people. Sometimes you share miles walking with somebody, and it's really great. And you feel such a sense of accomplishment. Even if it takes you 30 hours to finish because you walked the whole thing, you still got it done. You don't have to go into training for an event like this thinking maintain your marathon pace if you've done one, your 5K, your 10K pace during one of these events. There is nothing wrong, or it's no less of an accomplishment to finish a 100 miler in 30, 32 hours. You can think of it like you got your money's worth out of that race. You made it worth your while. And don't put off a race because you're afraid you can't hold an 8-minute mile pace for 12 hours or whatever, because you probably can't. Just have fun, relax, and walk it. Maybe run some miles, jog some miles, enjoy the miles.
Set your own terms.
Exactly.
Just enjoy it. I
Yep.
love that. It's brilliant. If athletes want to follow you, keep up with what you're doing,
sure.
where do they go?
I'm yet another Michelle on Instagram. I always claim that I'm going to talk more on there, but I think it's a battle of my full-time job being more active. But I will try and be more active on there at some point in the future. But yet another Michelle.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
A lot of fun.
Good luck with your podcast. I'm excited.
Thanks.
There are a lot of median athletes out there. So
yeah, if anyone else you think may want to join, send my way. It's one layer of doing episodes with people that you know already versus people that you don't. That would be a different scenario, but I'm just having fun with it, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah. Listen to his podcast.
All right, thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much.